She was fine just a second ago. She was fine. Those were the only words Ethan Carter could hear over the sudden silence that swallowed the cafe as Olivia Carter gripped the edge of the table with trembling fingers before slipping down into her chair, her small voice fading into something fragile and uncertain. The world seemed to stop in fragments, a cup tipping over, a chair scraping back, a startled gasp from nearby guests, but Ethan's mind refused to process anything except the sight of his 6-year-old daughter looking smaller than she ever had before. He stood up so fast his chair nearly fell, his voice breaking through the room as he called her name, but Olivia didn't respond, her eyes half-lidded, her breathing shallow and uneven. Panic rose in him like a wave he could not control, the same kind of fear he had buried years ago when nothing and no one could fix what mattered most. And for the first time in boardrooms, negotiations, or billion-dollar decisions, Ethan Carter realized money was useless in his hands. Across the cafe, Aaliyah Johnson froze for only a moment, her tray held steady at waist height, her dark eyes locking instantly onto the child instead of the chaos around her, and while others hesitated or stepped back, she stepped forward. "Sir," she said calmly, her voice cutting clean through the noise without urgency but with certainty. "Move her slightly to her side now." Ethan blinked at her as if he hadn't heard correctly, but something in her tone stopped him from questioning her, and instinct replaced doubt as he carefully adjusted Olivia as instructed. Aaliyah was already there, kneeling beside the table without hesitation, observing not with fear but with focus, her attention narrowing to every detail others missed. The color in Olivia's face, the rhythm of her breathing, the subtle signs everyone else had overlooked. "Has she eaten anything unusual today?" she asked quietly, not looking up, and Ethan shook his head, struggling to answer while trying to keep his composure. The cafe felt suddenly distant, as if the entire room had collapsed into a single point around this unknown waitress who spoke like she had already seen this moment before. Aaliyah reached into a small emergency kit she carried for work shifts no one ever asked about, her movements precise, steady, almost practiced, and when she spoke again her voice carried a calm that didn't belong to the situation. "She's not fading out. She's reacting to something sudden. We need to stabilize her breathing first." Ethan stared at her, disbelief fighting with desperation, because nothing about this moment made sense. Why would a waitress know this? Why was she the only one not panicking? Why did it feel like she was the only one in control of time itself? And as Olivia's fingers twitched slightly in her father's grip, Aaliyah looked up for the first time and said softly, almost as if confirming a truth no one else could see, "Don't worry, I know exactly what to do." And in that instant Ethan realized this wasn't just an accident in a cafe, and what happened next would change everything he believed about the people he had always ignored. The cafe felt as if it had narrowed into a single breath of time, every sound stretching and distorting around the small table where Olivia Carter lay still with her father holding her hand as if sheer presence alone could anchor her to the moment. And yet it was Aaliyah Johnson who held the room together without raising her voice. She reached for a glass of water, not to give it yet but to clear space, moving objects aside with careful precision, her eyes never leaving Olivia's face as if reading a language no one else in the room understood. Ethan Carter tried to steady himself, his voice tight as he asked if they should wait for emergency medical assistance, already pulling out his phone with trembling fingers. But Aaliyah shook her head slightly, not dismissive but certain, saying calmly that waiting without observation could cost valuable minutes, and that statement alone froze Ethan more than the situation itself because no one had ever spoken to him like that in a crisis involving his own child. Around them, guests had stopped pretending to eat, some standing, some whispering, all watching the strange contrast between a billionaire father losing control and a quiet waitress taking it back piece by piece. Aaliyah leaned slightly closer, her tone steady as she asked Ethan if Olivia had shown any signs earlier in the morning such as fatigue, reduced appetite, or dizziness, and Ethan hesitated before admitting that she had seemed slightly tired, but he had assumed it was from excitement about their outing. And at that Aaliyah's eyes sharpened just a fraction as if confirming an internal pattern. She gently adjusted Olivia's position again, ensuring her breathing remained open and unobstructed, then spoke in a low voice that carried no panic, only direction, asking Ethan to stay calm and keep speaking to his daughter because familiar voices could help maintain awareness. And Ethan found himself obeying without resistance, not because he trusted easily, but because something in Aaliyah's presence removed the option of chaos. She moved briefly to the side, scanning the cafe environment with quick efficiency, noting the layout, the distance to the entrance, the placement of chairs, and even the lighting, as if preparing for contingencies no one else had considered, then returned immediately to Olivia's side. Ethan watched her carefully now, confusion mixing with reluctant respect, because there was nothing performative about her actions, no hesitation for attention, only a quiet certainty that felt almost unsettling in its competence. He finally asked her where she had learned to respond like this, expecting a vague answer, but Aaliyah simply said she had once been in environments where recognizing early signs of distress was necessary, and that sometimes people ignored what was right in front of them until it became unavoidable. The words landed heavier than expected, not accusatory but honest, and Ethan felt an unfamiliar discomfort as he realized how quickly he had become dependent on someone he had never noticed before today. Olivia's breathing shifted slightly again, not worsening but unstable enough to tighten Ethan's chest, and Aaliyah immediately adjusted her posture and instructed him again in a calm, precise tone to remain steady and continue speaking softly to his daughter, reminding him that awareness often followed sound and familiarity, and as Ethan obeyed, his voice breaking slightly as he called Olivia's name again, Aaliyah stayed focused, her gaze unwavering, as if silently measuring every second that passed. The cafe outside world faded further away, and in that shrinking circle of urgency, Ethan Carter began to understand a truth he had never expected, that control was not always held by the person with money or authority, but sometimes by the person who chose to notice what everyone else ignored. The silence inside the cafe had changed shape, no longer sharp or chaotic but dense and heavy, as if every person in the room was holding their breath without realizing it. While Ethan Carter remained locked beside his daughter, his hand still wrapped around hers as though letting go would confirm every fear he was trying to deny. Aaliyah Johnson stayed close but not intrusive, her presence steady like an anchor in shifting water, her eyes continuing to track Olivia's breathing with calm precision that made time feel slower and more controlled than it actually was. Ethan tried to focus on anything familiar, the warmth of Olivia's small hand, the sound of her faint breaths, the distant murmur of people who did not know whether to leave or stay, but his attention kept drifting back to Aaliyah because she was the only person whose expression did not change with uncertainty. She asked him another quiet question, not about panic but about timing, specifically when Olivia had last eaten or drank anything beyond the morning, and Ethan paused before answering that they had shared a light breakfast around 2 hours earlier, something simple from their home before coming here, and as he said it he saw Aaliyah's gaze shift slightly as if assembling invisible pieces of information into a pattern only she could interpret. She adjusted her position again, not rushed but deliberate, and instructed Ethan to keep his voice even and consistent, reminding him that familiarity in tone could help maintain stability in moments like this. And although Ethan had led boardrooms where thousands of decisions were made in seconds, he found himself obeying her instructions without question because they were the only instructions that seemed to carry certainty. Around them, the cafe manager had approached cautiously but stopped at a distance, clearly unsure whether to intervene, while other guests lowered their phones, realizing they were witnessing something they did not fully understand. Ethan's frustration surfaced briefly as he looked toward the entrance, expecting emergency assistance to appear, but Aaliyah remained focused on Olivia instead of the door, and that difference in attention unsettled him in a way he could not explain because she was not waiting for help. She was actively working as if the solution depended entirely on what she could observe in the present moment. Olivia shifted slightly, her eyelids fluttering, and Ethan immediately leaned closer, calling her name softly, his voice breaking just enough to reveal the fear he had been trying to suppress, and Aaliyah gently guided his focus back to a steady rhythm, telling him to continue speaking because recognition often helped ground awareness. Ethan hesitated for a fraction of a second before doing so, and as he spoke, he realized how quickly he had surrendered control to someone he had never met before today. Aaliyah then asked him to recall if Olivia had experienced anything similar in the past, even mildly, and Ethan shook his head before admitting that she had always been healthy, active, full of energy, and that this sudden change was completely unexpected, and at that Aaliyah's expression shifted only slightly, not in alarm but in confirmation, as if eliminating possibilities one by one in her mind. She reached into her small bag again, retrieving a compact set of simple items that appeared ordinary but intentional, placing them carefully within reach while continuing to monitor Olivia's breathing with unwavering attention. Ethan watched her hands now instead of her face, noticing how controlled every movement was, how nothing was wasted, how every action served a purpose. And for the first time since the moment began, a thought formed in his mind that felt almost foreign, that the person everyone had assumed was just a waitress might be the only reason this situation was not spiraling beyond control. And as Olivia's breathing steadied just slightly under Aaliyah's calm direction, Ethan Carter began to understand that what he had witnessed so far was not luck or coincidence, but something far more rare, a kind of awareness and capability that did not announce itself with status or wealth, and that realization unsettled him more deeply than the crisis itself because it challenged everything he believed about who mattered in moments like this. The atmosphere inside the cafe had shifted again, not into panic but into something heavier and more focused, as if every second now carried measurable weight. While Ethan Carter stayed beside Olivia, his hand never leaving hers, his eyes locked on every small change as though watching closely could somehow influence the outcome. Aaliyah Johnson remained steady in her position, no longer moving quickly but instead observing with quiet precision, occasionally adjusting Olivia's posture by only a few inches, each adjustment deliberate and supported by reasoning Ethan did not yet understand. Ethan tried to stay composed, but his mind kept breaking into fragments of fear and disbelief because nothing about this moment aligned with the world he knew, where problems had solutions that arrived with speed, structure, and professional certainty. Here, everything depended on awareness, timing, and decisions made in silence. Aaliyah suddenly asked Ethan a new question, her tone still calm but more focused, asking whether Olivia had recently been exposed to heat, stress, or any unusual environment change within the last few hours, and Ethan hesitated, thinking harder this time, recalling their walk through the city streets, the light morning sun, and the short time they had spent outside before entering the cafe, and as he described it, Aaliyah's expression sharpened slightly as if narrowing down invisible possibilities. She did not react dramatically, but instead nodded once as if confirming something internally, then instructed Ethan to keep Olivia's breathing steady by continuing to speak to her in a calm and familiar tone, emphasizing consistency rather than urgency, and Ethan found himself following again without hesitation because her instructions carried a clarity that cut through his panic. Around them, the cafe staff had begun to assist by clearing nearby space, while guests had fully stopped pretending to ignore what was happening, though no one dared interrupt Aaliyah's focus because something about her presence made interference feel inappropriate. Ethan finally asked her directly how she knew what to do, his voice quieter now, less demanding and more uncertain, and Aaliyah paused only briefly before responding that she had once worked in environments where recognizing early warning signs in people was necessary, and that observation had become instinct rather than thought. She did not elaborate further, and the lack of explanation made Ethan even more curious, but there was no space for deeper questions because Olivia shifted again, her breathing changing rhythm in a way that immediately pulled everyone's attention back to her. Ethan leaned forward instinctively, fear tightening his chest again. But Aaliyah raised her hand slightly, not as a command but as a grounding signal, instructing him to remain steady and continue speaking to Olivia without breaking rhythm, and Ethan obeyed, his voice trembling slightly as he repeated his daughter's name in a calm and consistent tone. Aaliyah adjusted her position once more, her movements now even more precise, and Ethan noticed that she was timing every adjustment based on Olivia's responses, not guessing but responding to subtle changes most people would never notice. For the first time, Ethan began to realize that what he had assumed was simple assistance was actually structured observation, almost like a process built on experience he could not identify. His phone vibrated again in his pocket, a reminder of the world outside the cafe, meetings, contracts, responsibilities that normally defined his life, but none of it mattered in this moment because everything had collapsed into this single table, this single child, and this single woman who refused to panic. Aaliyah leaned slightly closer to Olivia again, speaking softly but clearly, not to Ethan this time but to the child, using a calm reassurance that carried no urgency but absolute certainty, and Olivia responded with a faint movement that suggested awareness was still present. Ethan felt a shift inside him, not resolution but something closer to reluctant trust, because despite every instinct that told him to rely on systems, doctors, and authority, The only stability in this moment was coming from someone no one in his world would have ever considered important enough to notice. And as the cafe outside continued to exist in silence around them, Ethan Carter began to understand something uncomfortable and undeniable, that control did not belong to the loudest or the wealthiest in a crisis, but to the one who could see clearly when everyone else was overwhelmed. The tension inside the cafe shifted once again, not outwardly louder but internally sharper, as if every person present could feel the weight of uncertainty pressing closer around the small table where Olivia Carter lay still, her breathing now slightly more stable but not yet fully consistent. Ethan Carter remained locked in place beside her, his hand still holding hers, but his mind was no longer only focused on fear, it was beginning to shift toward something else, something closer to desperate hope mixed with disbelief at the calm authority of the woman working beside him. Aaliyah Johnson stayed fully present, her attention narrowing further as she observed Olivia's subtle changes with increasing precision, her eyes moving between the child's breathing pattern, skin tone, and responsiveness, as if assembling a quiet internal map of what was happening that no one else could see. Ethan finally broke his silence, his voice low and unsteady as he asked if there was anything else they should be doing, anything he could provide or change, and for the first time Aaliyah paused slightly longer before responding, not because she was uncertain but because she was refining her assessment based on new observations. She asked Ethan a series of calm questions, this time more specific, about what Olivia had consumed earlier in the day, whether there had been anything unusual in her food or drink, and whether she had skipped any meals or had less appetite than normal, and Ethan tried to recall, carefully, his mind racing backward through the morning, remembering that Olivia had insisted on a small fruit smoothie before leaving their home, something she had not fully finished. As he mentioned this detail, Aaliyah's expression changed subtly, not with alarm but with recognition, as if a missing piece had finally clicked into place. She asked one more confirming question about timing, and when Ethan answered that it had been more than 3 hours ago, Aaliyah nodded once, slowly, as if validating an internal conclusion. She then explained in a calm and steady tone that Olivia's condition appeared consistent with a temporary imbalance in energy and hydration rather than something more severe, and while she did not use complicated language, her clarity immediately reduced the chaos in Ethan's mind. She turned slightly toward the cafe counter and requested something simple and immediate, asking for a source of natural sugar or juice, speaking with the same quiet authority she had used from the beginning, and for the first time the cafe staff responded without hesitation. Ethan watched as a glass of juice was prepared and brought over quickly, his mind struggling to process how this woman had transitioned from observer to decision-maker without ever raising her voice or demanding attention. Aaliyah carefully guided Ethan on how to support Olivia in small adjustments, while she ensured the child remained comfortable. And then she gently encouraged Olivia to take small sips when she was ready, not forcing anything but creating a calm environment around the action. Ethan held his breath as Olivia responded slowly, her small hand moving slightly as she accepted the drink, and within moments there was a subtle but noticeable change in her breathing pattern, becoming steadier and more consistent than before. Ethan felt something inside him loosen, not fully relieved yet but no longer purely consumed by fear, and for the first time since the collapse, he allowed himself to look at Aaliyah not as someone temporarily assisting but as the central reason things were not falling apart. He asked her quietly how she knew this would help, and Aaliyah simply replied that sometimes the body only needed stability and time to recover when the immediate danger had passed, and that careful observation often revealed more than panic ever could. Ethan leaned back slightly, absorbing her words, realizing that while he had spent his life relying on experts and systems, this moment had been guided by attention, patience, and understanding that no system had provided. Olivia's eyes fluttered slightly again, more present now, and Ethan instinctively leaned closer, calling her name gently, and this time there was a faint response that made his chest tighten not with fear but with overwhelming relief. Around them, the cafe felt less like a crisis scene and more like a suspended moment slowly returning to normal. Yet Ethan Carter understood that nothing about him had returned to normal at all, because the person he had dismissed without thought had just demonstrated a kind of capability that challenged every assumption he had ever made about who truly holds power. When everything else falls away, the cafe no longer felt like a place frozen in crisis, but rather a space slowly learning how to breathe again, as Olivia Carter's breathing steadied into a more natural rhythm while she remained in her father's arms. her small fingers still lightly curled around his hand. Ethan Carter sat motionless for a moment longer, as if afraid that any sudden movement might break the fragile stability that had just been achieved, while his eyes kept shifting between his daughter and Aaliyah Johnson, who remained calm and observant beside them. Aaliyah was no longer focused on immediate correction but instead on confirmation, watching Olivia's subtle signs with a quiet concentration that suggested she was ensuring the improvement was not temporary. Ethan finally exhaled for what felt like the first time in hours, his voice low and shaken as he asked if it was truly over, and Aaliyah responded not with certainty of finality, but with measured reassurance that the immediate concern had passed and that continued rest and hydration were important for full stabilization. Ethan nodded slowly, still processing everything that had happened, but before the moment could settle completely, a new presence entered the cafe space as a hospital staff member who had arrived following Ethan's earlier emergency request approached their table with cautious urgency, followed shortly by a second medical professional who began assessing Olivia from a respectful distance. Ethan instinctively stepped back to allow them access, his protective instinct still strong but now mixed with exhaustion, while Aaliyah quietly explained what had occurred in simple, clear terms without inserting herself unnecessarily into the medical authority that had just arrived. The professionals began asking questions, checking Olivia's condition and asking Ethan about timing and symptoms, and Ethan answered while still occasionally glancing toward Aaliyah, as if confirming internally that what she had done aligned with what the professionals were now observing. One of the medical staff members acknowledged that the situation appeared to have stabilized more quickly than expected given the initial description, and Ethan felt a strange tension rise in him because he knew that stabilization had not come from the systems he had called, but from the quiet woman standing slightly behind him. Aaliyah remained composed, stepping back further once the professionals fully took over, her posture returning to what it had been before the incident, calm and almost invisible again, as if she had never taken control at all. Ethan noticed this shift immediately, and something inside him resisted it because the contrast between what she had just done and how she was now presenting herself felt impossible to reconcile. Once the medical team confirmed that Olivia's condition was improving and that transport for observation would be a precaution rather than an emergency, the tension in the cafe finally eased, and people began to return to their seats slowly, though the atmosphere remained permanently altered. Ethan stayed close to Olivia as she became more alert, her eyes opening fully for the first time since the collapse, and when she softly called his name, relief broke through his controlled expression in a way he could not fully hide. In that moment, he instinctively turned toward Aaliyah, who was already stepping slightly away as if preparing to return to her work, and Ethan stopped her with a quiet voice, asking her to wait. Aaliyah paused, her expression neutral but attentive, and Ethan struggled briefly to find the right words because gratitude felt insufficient compared to what had just occurred. He finally asked her who she was, not in the formal sense of identity, but in the deeper sense of understanding how someone like her could remain unnoticed while possessing such clarity and capability, and Aaliyah simply replied that she was someone who paid attention when others did not. Ethan fell silent at that answer, realizing it was not an evasion but a statement of truth that carried more weight than any explanation of credentials or background could provide. As the medical team prepared to leave with Olivia for further evaluation, Ethan watched Aaliyah one last time in that moment, fully aware that the encounter had shifted something fundamental in him, because for the first time in his life he understood that influence was not always tied to wealth or position, but sometimes belonged entirely to those who chose to see what others refused to notice. As the cafe slowly returned to its normal rhythm, the moment of crisis no longer dominated the room, but its echo still lingered in the air like something invisible that everyone could feel but no one could fully describe. While Olivia Carter was now being gently guided by medical staff toward further observation, and Ethan Carter walked beside her, refusing to let go of her hand even for a second. His face carried the exhaustion of a man who had just been stripped of certainty, but also something new forming beneath it, a quiet awareness that what had happened today could not be explained through his usual world of logic and control. Aaliyah Johnson stood a few steps behind, no longer at the center of attention, her presence returning to the background as naturally as it had once been unnoticed, but Ethan kept looking back at her, unable to reconcile the distance between what she had done and how quietly she now existed again. As the medical team confirmed again that Olivia was stable enough for transport and routine monitoring, Ethan felt the pressure in his chest finally loosen, and for the first time since entering the cafe, he allowed himself to fully breathe. Olivia turned her head slightly toward him and gave a faint, tired smile, and that small expression broke something inside him in a way no business success or financial victory ever had. When the medical staff prepared to leave, Ethan hesitated, then stopped completely and turned back toward Aaliyah, who was now collecting herself to return to work as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. He walked toward her slowly, not with authority but with something closer to uncertainty, and when he reached her, the noise of the cafe faded again into the background. Ethan looked at her for a long moment before speaking, his voice quieter than anyone in that room had ever heard from him, and he told her that what she had done was not something he could simply repay or acknowledge with money, because it had changed everything about how he understood the world. Aaliyah listened without interrupting, her expression steady, neither proud nor dismissive, as if she had heard similar words before from people who only understood value through crisis. Ethan then asked her again, more directly this time, who she really was and how she had learned to act with such certainty when everyone else was overwhelmed, and Aaliyah paused briefly before answering that she had spent years learning to observe before reacting, because hesitation in certain moments cost more than explanation ever could. Her answer was simple, but it carried a weight that Ethan could not ignore, because it revealed a philosophy of life completely different from the one he had built his entire identity on. For a moment neither of them spoke, and in that silence Ethan realized that he was not standing in front of someone who had helped him by accident, but someone whose entire way of seeing the world operated on a level he had never been forced to consider. Olivia was finally moved toward the exit with gentle care, and Ethan followed, but before leaving he looked back one last time at Aaliyah, who had already turned slightly away, preparing to continue her shift as if the world had not just shifted around her presence. That final image stayed with him because in that moment Ethan Carter understood something he could not yet fully articulate, that the most important moments in life were not always shaped by those who commanded attention, but by those who quietly stepped forward when everyone else hesitated. The hospital corridor outside the cafe was quieter than the chaos that had unfolded earlier, but for Ethan Carter it felt heavier, as if silence itself had become something that pressed against his thoughts and forced him to finally process what had just happened. Olivia Carter was now resting under observation, her condition described by medical staff as stable and no longer concerning, yet Ethan still stayed close, sitting beside her small bed while holding her hand, unable to detach himself from the fear that had only recently begun to fade. Every few seconds he replayed the moment in the cafe, not the panic, but the calm voice that had cut through it, the steady presence of Aaliyah Johnson who had stepped forward when everyone else hesitated. Now, sitting in the quiet hospital room, Ethan found himself unable to focus on anything except that contrast between systems he trusted all his life and a person he had never noticed until today. Olivia shifted slightly in her sleep, and Ethan instinctively leaned closer, watching her breathe more evenly now, the color returning to her face in a way that reassured him more than any medical report could. Still, his mind kept returning to Aaliyah, and after several minutes of silence, he stood up and walked out of the room, telling the nurse he would be back shortly, though his real intention was something he could not yet fully define. He returned to the cafe alone, not because he needed anything physically, but because he needed to understand something that had unsettled him far more than the emergency itself. The cafe had returned to normal operations, tables being cleared, soft conversations resuming, and the lighting now warm and familiar again. Yet Ethan saw it differently, as if the memory of what had happened was still embedded in every corner. He spotted Aaliyah near the service counter, quietly organizing supplies as though her shift had never been interrupted, her movements steady and unremarkable, blending into the environment in a way that made her almost invisible again. Ethan approached slowly, not as a billionaire accustomed to being recognized, but as a father still trying to process gratitude that did not fit neatly into his world. When Aaliyah noticed him, she paused politely, her expression calm and neutral, waiting without assumption. Ethan hesitated before speaking, and when he did, his voice carried none of the confidence people usually associated with him, only sincerity. He told her that his daughter was stable and resting, and that the doctors had confirmed there was no ongoing danger, and for the first time since everything began, he saw a subtle shift in her expression, not pride, but quiet acknowledgement. He then admitted that he did not know how to thank her properly, because what she had done could not be measured in the same way as anything he was used to valuing, and Aaliyah listened without interrupting, her hands resting calmly at her side. After a moment, she simply replied that she was glad the child was safe, as if that alone was the only outcome that mattered, and Ethan felt an unfamiliar discomfort at how simple her response was compared to the complexity of everything he was trying to process. He asked her again, more carefully this time, where she had learned to stay. So composed when everything around her was breaking into chaos, and Aaliyah paused briefly before saying that she had learned to observe before reacting, because in many situations, reacting too late meant missing what was already clear in front of you. Her answer was calm, almost understated, but it landed in Ethan's mind with unexpected weight, because it revealed a perspective he had never needed to develop in his world of controlled environments and immediate responses. For a long moment, Ethan said nothing, realizing that every system he trusted depended on structure and speed, while everything she had demonstrated depended on awareness and patience. Finally, he told her that people like her should not remain unnoticed, that what she had done deserved recognition far beyond a cafe shift. But Aaliyah simply responded that recognition was not what had saved his daughter, awareness had. That single statement stayed with Ethan as he stood there, because it reframed everything he thought he understood about value, contribution, and importance. When he finally turned to leave, he looked back once more, seeing Aaliyah already returning to her work without ceremony or expectation. And, in that quiet return to normality, Ethan Carter understood that the most powerful people he had ever encountered were not the ones who demanded attention, but the ones who never needed it in the first place. The evening had fully settled over the city by the time Ethan Carter left the cafe for the final time, but nothing about the world around him felt familiar anymore, as if the events of the day had shifted something permanent inside his perception. He stood outside for a moment, looking back through the glass window, seeing Aaliyah Johnson inside continuing her work with quiet consistency, moving between tables as though nothing extraordinary had ever happened, and that contrast stayed with him longer than anything else. His daughter Olivia was now resting safely at the hospital, her condition stable according to the doctors, and yet Ethan found it difficult to accept that explanation alone, because what he had witnessed earlier did not feel like something that could be reduced to a simple medical summary. As he walked toward his car, he realized that for the first time in years, he was not thinking about contracts, acquisitions, or market movements, but about a single person whose name he had only just learned, Aaliyah Johnson. In his mind, her presence replayed repeatedly, not as dramatic action but as quiet certainty. The way she had spoken when everyone else hesitated, the way she had observed when others panicked, and the way she had stepped forward without expectation of recognition. Later that night, after visiting Olivia once more at the hospital and confirming she was sleeping peacefully, Ethan sat alone in the hospital lounge, his phone resting untouched. Beside him, while his thoughts continued to circle back to the same unanswered question, how someone so easily overlooked could demonstrate such clarity in a moment when everything else failed. He opened his laptop briefly, not for work, but to search the cafe where everything had happened, and found only basic information, nothing that explained what he had experienced. There were no mentions of training, no public recognition, nothing that matched the level of composure she had shown. This absence of information only deepened his curiosity rather than resolving it. Over the next morning, Ethan returned to the hospital early, but Olivia was already awake, smiling faintly and asking for water, her recovery continuing without complication, and that sight brought him a relief so deep it temporarily quieted his restless thoughts. Yet even while sitting beside her, he found himself distracted again, because he could not separate his gratitude from his curiosity about the woman who had made this recovery possible in the first place. When Olivia fell back asleep, Ethan made a decision he did not fully understand himself, and returned once more to the cafe, not as a billionaire or employer, but as someone searching for an answer. The cafe was quieter in the morning, sunlight falling across empty tables, and Aaliyah was once again working her shift with the same calm precision, as if nothing in her life had changed. When she noticed him, there was no surprise, only polite acknowledgement, and Ethan approached slowly, stopping at a respectful distance. He told her that Olivia was recovering well and that the doctors expected a full recovery, and for a brief moment Aaliyah's expression softened slightly, not with pride, but with quiet relief that felt deeply genuine. Ethan then admitted that he could not leave without understanding what he had seen, not because he doubted the outcome, but because he could not reconcile her presence with the expectations he had carried his entire life. Aaliyah listened, then simply said that she did what anyone should do when they notice something others miss, and that saving a child was not something that required explanation beyond responsibility. Ethan stood in silence for a moment, realizing that in his world, everything had always been explained by status, training, or title, but in her world, it was explained by awareness and choice. When he finally left the cafe again, there was no dramatic conclusion, no exchange of promises, only a quiet understanding forming in Ethan Carter's mind that the most important people he would ever encounter might never appear in the places he expected, and that true value was often found in those who never asked to be seen.